Okay, so again, welcome everybody. Today we are going to be talking about an introduction to beekeeping. I have my friend and fellow beekeeper here with me, Mark Covington from the Georgia Street Community Collective. Welcome everybody. So let's see. Before we get into the slides, there was a request for putting on captions. I don't know how to do that, Valeria, unfortunately. So if anybody can tell me as we're going along, I'll try and make that happen, but I've never done that before. But in any case, I thought I'd start out with a little bit of a conversation with Mark, just to get you guys familiar with a fellow beekeeper and their kind of backstory. So Mark, how long you been keeping bees?
I believe I'm going into my 9th year.
Okay. And how did you get started?
Well, we started with the community garden. We started with the community garden, and some of the plants wasn't growing that good, and people started talking about maybe the pollinators wasn't that good over here. So I decided to take the bee class and get some bees, and instantly it changed everything. So, and I fell in love with the bees.
Yeah, tell me more about that. Why do you enjoy beekeeping?
Well, of course the honey, but I like the interaction with the bees. Like, you can literally tell that they know you in most hives, because you can be a ways away and a bee will come and land on you and just stay there. You know, it's like almost like they get familiar with you.
Nice. And over the years, what has been, are there any other kind of exciting or interesting experiences that you could tell us about from your history with beekeeping?
Yeah, one time I actually had a queen hatch out, like literally in my hand, out of a cell. I put her in a little bowl, went back in, came back out, and like she was almost out. So I picked it up to see, what she was doing, and literally came out into my hand. So I had a virgin queen right in my hand.
Wow, that's fun. How often do you get stung?
On purpose or by mistake?
Well, both. Talk about that.
So probably about every 6 months, I sting myself in my knee or my shoulder, because I have arthritis in my knee and I had a torn rotator cuff, and it helps with the pain and movement. But by mistake, I probably maybe 3 or 4 times during the season. But I mean, I like it. It's almost like a B12 shot. It's a boost of energy to me. I'm not saying everybody's going to experience that. I'm not allergic to bees, so of course, and it's like an energy shot to me. So sometimes I think I'm addicted to it.
Do you ever accidentally, I mean, but how often do you accidentally get stung sometimes?
About 3 or 4 times a season.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't mind them stinging me anywhere, as long as they don't sting me in my face and my head.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's talk more about, and I'll share a little bit of my backstory. So I've been keeping bees, since 2007, so almost 15 years. And I got into it essentially because I was helping start this program, this Sweet on Detroit program, to train beekeepers in the city. And it seemed like a good idea to get the backstory and know it a little bit more. And I just, wow, it was such a fascinating pastime that I got into it, and I started keeping bees. Used to keep bees at home, but now I'm mostly keeping bees with Keeper in Detroit at our farm. And I really enjoy, there's some times when you just go and manage the hives that, like, nothing, everything else in the world shuts out because you got to focus on what's going on in the hive. So there's something very peaceful and meditative about keeping bees that I appreciate. So yeah, So everybody who's in the class, welcome once again. The intent of today is to give you kind of a big picture view of what it takes to be a beekeeper, a little bit of information about bees and the inner workings of the hive, and a sense of costs costs that you're going to need to consider, a sense of the time commitment, and some of the challenges that you may face as a beekeeper. Definitely going to encourage folks to ask questions as we're going along. We're going to cover, I think, a lot of information. Please direct your questions to the chat. And, Mark and I are going to kind of be bouncing back and forth, sharing information on the slides and our experiences with them. And we'll kind of take it from there. Okay. So yeah, I guess with that, we'll go ahead and get started with the presentation. Okay. So this is another local farmer, Mr. Will Gardner. Back when he did the bee class, this must have been somewhere around 2012 over on in Hamtramck at some hives we were keeping over there some years ago. Currently we have a bee club that with beekeepers all over the city. We have about, I think, 50 members keeping bees all across the city. Lots of folks who have done our class. So we'll get out with, kind of start out with why keep bees. There's some obvious ones like honey, of course, but wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about some of the other things that you may not be familiar with. So, pollinators is probably one, for just the natural environment. If you aren't aware, there's a lot of habitat loss for pollinators across the nation, with wild areas being developed over time, and into real estate developments and all that kind of thing, and industrial agriculture, disrupting habitat for pollinators. And when I say pollinators, I'm lumping honeybees in with lots of other native pollinators. There's literally hundreds of native bees that are also very, very important, that are experiencing challenges. So keeping bees gets you kind of in tune to the needs of these, because they contribute a huge amount to the world in pollinating for our food crops, and for kind of the natural, being a major player in the natural flow ecosystem. So like bees pollinate plants, and there's things that are there's lots of things connected in that. So there's one thing that my experience has been really strong with is, and I think is really fun and interesting, is just a general, when you're keeping bees, you have to pay attention to what's going on in the season. So it's a real connection to the flow. Like, for instance, we've had a really late spring this year, and we're aware of this as gardeners as well, but in particular, like as beekeepers, we're really looking out for when the first flowers are that the bees can forage are out. So like I'm looking out my window right now, and the maple trees are just starting to bloom in my neighborhood, which is a real good sign that the bees, that's one of the first flowering plants that are nectar forage for bees. Dandelions are another one. Mark, can you talk about just your experience with like observing and learning about bees, like just any kind of insights on why that's important, or why you enjoy that?
Yeah, well, I mean, of course, we want the nectar flow and and pollen to be coming into the hives, but even water sources, like bees being able to get out to get water, And then like seeing dandelion, clover, and that's like a healthy environment or a healthy habitat for the bees. They can go out and forage. But also there's a number of trees, like you said, the maple and a few other trees that they can get nectar from.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yeah, I mean, and as we talk, we'll get into it more, but there's, the inner workings of the hive is a real fascinating world of how the different characters, the queens and the drones and the workers, and how they work together and what happens at different points in the season and mating and all that kind of stuff. So we'll get into that a little bit more as we go along here. So honey, this is probably the one that everybody thinks about the most when they think about getting into beekeeping. Honey flavors depend on the types of flowers that are being foraged. So like, there's different types of honeys, based on what the main forage for the bees are. The bees tend to forage, they send out scouts to up to 2 miles to find a good nectar forage, and they have this whole communication process using what's called a waggle dance, and they use the way that they move their bodies to indicate a really good nectar source, for instance, and they'll tend to go on that they'll keep going to that spot until they pacified. So if it's clover, for instance, you will have a very strong clover flavor, or buckwheat, very unique flavor, basswood, and so on. We don't do manuka closely, but that's the one that people talk about. But there's all kinds of different flavored honeys. I've been slowly collecting honeys from around the world with my travels and friends' travels. So that's been really fun, usually with the class, and I'll be doing that with the class again this year. We'll do a little bit of a honey tasting of different honeys from around the world. I got some new ones from Mexico. I think there's one from Spain. A friend just brought me. Honey's also known for its antibacterial properties. Way back in the day, it used to be used for wounds because it's antiseptic and antimicrobial. So you can, it used to be used to dress a cut or a wound. Some people also take it as a supplement to address their allergies. Like it can help kind of mitigate if you have particular seasonal allergies, with introducing a little bit of the, flower nectar and in the little specks of pollen that are present in the honey. Can help you kind of address. Some people claim that it really helps them address their allergy problems. So I'm going to show a quick movie on how honey is made. And I'll jump to 20.
Friends would walk up to me and just be like, "What the f is in your mug?" And I would just tell them it's mud.
The Beehive will make and consume more than 50 kilograms of honey in a single year. And that takes a lot of work.
Okay, making sure everybody can see that okay? Yep.
Honey is made from nectar, but it doesn't come out of flowers as that golden sticky stuff. But after finding a suitable food source, bees dive in head first, using their long, specially adapted tongues to slurp up tiny sips of nectar into one of 2 stomachs. A single bee might have to drink from more than 1,000 flowers to fill its honey stomach, which can weigh as much as the bee itself when full of nectar. Now, on the way back to the hive, digestive enzymes are already working to turn that nectar into sweet gold. When she returns to the hive, the forager bee will vomit the nectar into the mouth of another worker, and that bee will vomit it into another bee's mouth, and so on. This game of regurgitation telephone is an important part of the honey-making process, since each bee adds more digestive enzymes to turn long chains of complex sugars in the raw nectar into simple monosaccharides like fructose and glucose. Now at this point, the nectar is still pretty watery, so the bees beat their wings and create an air current inside the hive to evaporate and thicken the nectar. finally capping the cell with beeswax so the enzyme-rich bee barf can complete its transformation into honey. Because of its low water content and acidic pH, honey isn't a very inviting place for bacteria or yeast spoilage. It has an incredibly long shelf life in the hive or in your pantry. Honey has even been found in Egyptian tombs dating back thousands of years, pretty much unspoiled. Although I wouldn't personally eat it, just in case. For 1 pound of honey, tens of thousands of foraging bees will together fly more than 3 times around the world and visit up to 8 million flowers. That takes teamwork and organization. And although they can't talk, they do communicate with body language. Foragers dance to tell other bees where to find food. A circle dance means flowers are pretty close to the hive, but for food that's farther away, they get their waggle on. The waggle dance of the honeybee was first decoded by Carl von Frisch, and it's definitely one of the coolest examples of animal communication in nature. First, the bee walks in a straight line, wagging its body back and forth and vibrating its wings, before repeating in a figure 8. Now, whatever angle the bee walks while waggling tells the other bees what direction to go. If it's straight up the line of the honeycombs, then the food is in the direction of the sun. If the dance is pointed to the left or the right, the other bees know to fly at that angle relative to the sun. The longer the waggle, the farther away the food is. And the better the food, the more excited the bee shakes its body. If that's not amazing enough, even if they can't see the sun itself, they can infer where it is and the time of day by reading the polarization of light in the blue sky. A single bee is a pretty simple creature, but together they create highly complex and social societies. There's 3 main classes in a beehive: drones, workers, and queens. And when a new
Okay, we'll get into that a little bit more. I lost my, where did it go? Okay. Oops. Okay, so moving on to Propolis. Mark, will you take this one?
So Propolis is known as, I guess that's another part of the medicinal parts of a hive. A lot of people take Propolis and they make tinctures for certain ailments and topical solutions. And people make it out of alcohol or liquor in making the tinctures.
There you go, sorry. Yeah, so it's collected, basically the bees are collecting it, the resins from other plants. So basically making this like sticky stuff that they use, like the kind of the caulk or the glue inside the hive, so they fill up gaps or joint in all the joints and openings. Essentially, the bees are trying to, they don't like to let air or light inside of the hive, to be protecting the young and so forth. Next is beeswax. Mark, can you do me a favor and take a look at the chat and let me know if there's any questions that are relevant to the, and we'll try and address the questions as we're going here.
Okay, give me a second. My screen is fuzzing up. I don't know if it's the computer or what.
Okay. Is everybody else good on the presentation? Stop share for 1 sec.
Oh, there you go. It's clear now.
Okay, good. And so we'll go back. Great. Is that good?
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, beeswax. So beeswax is basically used to construct the inner the home of the bees inside of in our cases inside of hives. In the kind of natural environment or the native environment of bees, they often found homes in hollowed out trees or enclosed spaces. I mean, they're always looking for something with kind of covering all sides. Nowadays, sometimes they'll find their way into the eaves of houses or in the walls of houses. Sometimes people will do what are called cutouts to establish, basically try and remove a hive from a wall or something like that. But essentially, bees they consume honey, and they have the ability to process inside of their body and excrete out of their hind side wax, which then they link their legs together and draw out comb in these hexagon shapes that we're familiar with. Pretty fascinating. It's and one of the kind of engineering feats of this comb is that empty comb is actually super light. It's like, an empty frame without any honey in it and just the wax comb from the bees is, a quarter of a pound at most. But that full, that comb full of honey, capped honey, will be upwards of 6 pounds. So it's got the structural integrity, the strength to be able to, for them to store the honey in a very elegant and efficient way. So basically, the female workers, they have these glands on their abdomens, and we're going to watch a video in a second. And they are able to make that wax and extrude it out of their bodies.
We got 3 questions in the chat.
Okay.
One is, should I be concerned about bees pollinating my crops? And I don't really understand that. Are you concerned about them pollinating good or bad, or what's the actual question? Red flower growers.
Okay. Maybe Tiffany, you want to come off mute for that one? Okay, I'll just try and my sense is that, like, should I be doing something to make sure that my bees are present? So, I mean, bees are going to be attracted to our crops typically, and we can do lots of things to invite them. By having flowering plants that are particularly interesting for bees. Lots of things. There's a lot of native varieties, and anything with what's called an umbel, like a flower that looks like an upside down umbrella. So dills and fennels and things of that sort. There's basically trying to have, as a general statement, trying to have flowering plants all throughout the season is going to be an incentive for bees to visit your yard and help pollinate your crops. Okay, other questions?
Yep. Second question is there anything you can put on to try to prevent bee stings while wearing the bee suit?
The bee suit itself is going to be, I mean, there's definitely, if you're tied up good, and we'll show some examples of the bee suits later, the odds of getting stung are pretty slim at that point. You just got to make sure that you are closing all the openings. And I want to make a note that, like, if you may, in the video in the beginning, you saw me with those bees all flying around me and on me. They're not defensive unless they have a reason to be defensive, and that typically is when they actually have, so in that point, when I'm installing the package, they're generally pretty docile because they don't really have anything to protect at that point. They don't have a home. They're waiting for a home. They don't have any honey to protect. They don't have any babies yet at that point. So they're really chill. And generally speaking, bees are pretty docile. They will, and if you get stung, we'll talk about a few things to do in response, but essentially you're just trying to, if you get stung, you usually want to walk away from the hive pretty quickly afterward, because at that point they will give off a pheromone to tell the other bees that like they're in defensive mode. So there are a number of signs, and for folks in the class, we'll get into that much more detail as the class goes on.
Third one is wax bee poop.
Okay, final, any say again?
Is wax bee poop.
No, it is not bee poop. Bee poop is something altogether separate. And this video will really help illustrate that. So that little stuff coming off of the abdomen there, that is, the excretion that becomes the wax. Totally separate from poop. Okay, and then, and this is what it looks like when the bees are actually making the
Drinking water
comb.
before bed burns 46 pounds in 2 weeks. If you are struggling
Anyhow,
to
we're here
lose
to
weight
talk
and you're
about
over
beeswax. Look at it from where we start in the hive through the process into turning it into something usable in the way of a candle that we can put up for sale. Nature's best, pure beeswax. Surprising, we do a lot of fairs. People come up by the table and beeswax. Wow, we haven't seen anything made out of beeswax for a long time. And when people are talking, they're listening to what you're saying about the beeswax, where it is pure. Some people are really glad to be able to buy something that doesn't have some kind of a scent in it. It's like, well, what does it smell like? Well, when beeswax burns, it basically just gives off a pleasant aroma, and it's clean. People that burn every other candles that are out there, they wonder why their windows have a film on them. And there's, they've had cleaning companies and come in and say, well, I can't get this film off. And that's the first question the cleaning companies ask them, well, what do you burn? It's like, well, we burn this candle and that candle. And they said, that's what's put.
Okay. The main reason I wasn't really interested in showing you guys have that guy get talking, but the focus here was just showing that these bees that they're locking their legs. And there's another, locking their legs in kind of a form that, for the process of extruding what ultimately becomes the comb. So, after the actual processing of after the bees use it, and as we're processing honey, and there's periods throughout the season where we are, dealing with wax and there's scraps, and we save all that and you can melt it down and for future uses. So let's keep going here. Another product is pollen. Bees collect pollen on their legs when they're visiting flowers. So typically they're either, when they go out and forage, they're foraging for two main things. Well, three. The two main for their sustenance are pollen, which is their source of protein. It's what they feed their babies when they're growing up. And then honey, nectar, which becomes honey, is their source of carbohydrates. It gives them energy to do what they need to do. So you can see on this bee in the lower right hand corner that this little girl has these little yellow sacs on the back of their legs. So basically, as they're going around, they're collecting the pollen will collect all over their bodies, and they'll slowly push it and pack it onto their hind legs, and that's how they carry it back to the hive. The pollen is an indicator that is another indicator that in the seasonality of beekeeping, when you can see bees taking in pollen, that you can see them when you see them coming into the entrance of the hive and they have the pollen sacs on the back of their legs in the beginning of the season. That's another indicator that that the flow is going, that the honey flow, there's lots of good nectar source out there, that there's and that they have what they need to raise new babies. So it's a good indicator that the season has begun, and that they are able to really start to kick off for the season. And so there will be points in the season when pollen source will be maybe slightly less available. So that and then for human consumption, people use it as a nutritional supplement. Lots of folks will try it as for allergies or inflammation. And a lot of people say a lot of good things about it. There's no conclusive scientific research at this point or evidence that it works for these things, but it doesn't hurt to, if you are dealing with allergies, for instance, or some people will use it for wounds and things like that. And there's no harm in using it and trying it. And it is interesting and tasty. It has it's a little bit dry, but it has a really flowery, really it tastes like the essence of a flower when you're smelling it, kind of thing. And some people will make a supplement which is a combination of the honey and the pollen called bee bread. And that's, you can put that on toast or something. So it tastes good too. There's a tricky way to collect this from the bees, and there's basically this pollen trap, they call it, and you basically put it on the hive, and when they enter through the entrance and they walk through there's these bars that they set up that are set up inside of the pollen trap, that essentially the bee has to squeeze through it, and it knocks the pollen off their legs, so you can collect the pollen off of those trays. You got to be careful with that, just to make sure that you don't want to leave that on all the time, because the bees definitely need that pollen. But if you wanted to harvest it for your own purposes, it's a balancing act, and making sure that you allow that.
Two questions.
Any additions to any of the things that we just talked about, Mark, in terms of pollen, honey, propolis?
Just the pollen, I know I was reading that some people think that pollen is a good source of probiotics, so it boosts your immune system and your gut.
Okay, yeah, I've heard about that.
Yeah.
Devin is asking, is there any way to artificially supplement the protein intake of a colony if in the urban source of pollen isn't enough? So there are artificial pollen artificial pollen products out there. Practically speaking, I've talked to a lot of beekeepers, and you will definitely get different opinions about, do we need this or do we not need this? But the general consensus is that, Michigan, Detroit, our region is a pretty diverse source. There's pretty diverse sources of pollen available, so it's usually not needed. It's something that it is kind of part and parcel to the young queen getting off and started. If she's laying eggs, the young worker bees needed to be feeding pollen to the young developing bees. And so that, if you're trying to, at the beginning of the season, when you're starting a new beehive and you want to stimulate them to increase population to ultimately do all the things that they do, that's something that people will do early in the spring, is put pollen sources on. But with the kickoff of the maples and all the other flowers that we have in our region, it's generally not a concern. And then another question, do you have a special place to keep the pollen within the hive? Do they have a special place to keep the pollen within the hive? Great question. Yes, they do. We haven't quite gotten to that point, but essentially they store it inside the cells, in short. And they usually store it inside the cells around where they keep the babies. So if you think of, so the bees, the queen is laying eggs in cells inside usually the lower 1 or 2 boxes of the hive in an area that occupies about the space of a basketball, which is called the brood nest. And so if you just imagine that there's these slices of frames that are about the size, slices of comb, that because they go up and down like a, about an inch thick slices with bee space in between them so they can access both sides. So that's about the shape of a football, but that on the outer edges of that, a continuation of that into the in the hive, into the shape of the box on the edges of that is where they store the pollen. So another thing that people keep bees, another reason that people keep bees is to essentially proliferate the line. So if you have raising queens, so like it's not just about the products, pollen, propolis, honey, but it's also about raising more bees. So like you have the ability, once you get some skills on how the bees function, to make more hives. And part of that is raising queens. And there's a whole process to that. I'm not going to dive too deep into that, just to say you could raise queens, you could sell queens for $30 or $50. There's definitely a lot of interest, and it's a great thing to, as in a region, in a state, like, example is that most of our bees, like when we're buying package bees, when we're purchasing bees, like the bees I installed at the beginning of the class, those are either coming from Georgia or California or Texas. And it's all kind of related to the current, industrial system of how beekeeping works in our country. And it's all related to, pollination, pollinating like these almond and the migratory pollination that large scale beekeepers do. And there's a system that, selling bees has become a side hustle of that. But there's something to be said for the regionality of bees, and trying to develop bees from that are thriving in warm environments are not going to necessarily do as well in northern climates. So there's a lot of interest and emphasis on trying to raise local bees for local economies, one, and for developing strains of bees that are more acclimated to our local region. So raising queens is a part of that. Mark, can you talk a little bit about making up nucleus colonies or splits, and what goes into that?
Okay. Well, there's a way to make splits. So when you go into your hive and you're checking your frames, if to see if the queen is laying, sometimes you'll notice, like on that last slide, these peanut shaped cells, and those are queens. And if you see queens in your hive, you can take those queens or those frames and actually start another hive, which would be a nook or a split. And you just take that frame out with worker bees, with nurse bees, some drones, some pollen, some nectar, and possibly some honey, and you could start another hive. And that queen will hatch out, she'll go out to mate, and then she'll come back and you'll have a new hive.
Yeah, and nucleus is, this is another way that if you are interested in taking this on as a business, or if for like local bee clubs, or just to make another contribution to the local beekeeping, is to every year work on the hives that survive the winter, making splits to share with other beekeepers or sell to other beekeepers. A nuke can sell up to, a nucleus colony can be sold for up to $200 if it's good quality. And the intention of it is a starter colony. This would be the other option for starting a new hive, other than there's two other options. There's three options for starting a new hive. You're either starting with a package like I used in the beginning, that you get the box of bees and the queen, you got the nucleus like Mark just discussed, and then catching a swarm would be another option. Okay, so now getting down to the nitty gritty of like what it takes to get started and what kind of investment you should anticipate.
Scary part.
Yeah. Yeah, so, it's generally recommended that you start with at least 2 hives. And that's because of the challenges of beekeeping, and that, it's if you only have 1 hive, you have no frame of reference for how they're, especially when you're brand new, you have no frame of reference for how they're really doing. Usually if you have 2 hives, you'll see them developing at different rates, and that gives you a sense of really how they're supposed to, of the different kinds of extremes that they could have. And overwintering a hive is got its challenges with the pest problems that are present and such. So if you lose 1 hive over the winter, you still have another that, in theory, you could make a split off of next spring and kind of be back where you were at the beginning, instead of, if you have 1 hive and you lose it during the winter, then you're starting from scratch next season, and another, couple $100 are down the drain. So typically, if you're purchasing bees, they're going to cost, a package of bees somewhere in the neighborhood of about $130. A nuke is between 180 and $200. Hive equipment. So for the standard, the typical standard length straw style hive is about $150 to $200. And then protective gear is, you can get there's some cheaper options. And then there's some, depending on if you're just getting a jacket or if you're getting a full suit or just a veil. Always, recommend at least the veil and the gloves, but you're looking at $30 to $100. And then, general tools you need are a hive tool and a smoker. So that's somewhere around $50. So all in all, if you're just getting 1 hive, you're looking about $400. But if you're starting 2 hives, you're looking, closer to 620 or something like that, somewhere in that neighborhood. So just to give you, a general sense of costing. Mark, you wanted to speak to this one a little bit?
Yeah. Okay. Well, like Keto was saying about the Hive Die-Offs, so technically it's not easy because you can get attached to your hives. But the national rates of hive loss is 50%. I would say here in our bee club is probably a little more than 50%. And then the pest, like the varroa mites, is like the biggest problem that we've been seeing. And then climate change. So this year, going into the winter, I had a hive, and like February, early March, I go out to check the hive and they're gone. And I saw them on that warm day we had in February. So they were there. And then habitat loss. Again, in my experience, like here, the first few years, maybe about 4 or 5 years we were keeping bees, we had real huge successes. And I attribute it to the city cutting up vacant lots more. We used to have, I know some of you remember, they only cut the lots once or twice a year, and now they do it like 4 or 5 times a year. And I think that has had an effect on our beekeeping here at Georgia Street.
Could you talk, why is that though? Why would you say that is? Like cutting more means like the bees didn't seem to be building up as much?
Yeah, it took longer for honey, to get honey in the hives. You didn't see a lot of pollen. But I believe it's because of we had the weeds and the wildflowers, or native flowers and stuff in the vacant lots. And when the city started cutting them more, that took that habitat away. So they didn't have the foraging as good as foraging as they did in the past. So that's a good idea. It's a good idea to start creating our own wildflower patches and, planting native flowers and stuff for the bees.
Okay. Yeah, for sure. So yeah, beekeeping is challenging. It's it's something that you have to make it, if you're gonna make the, I just want to really emphasize, if you're gonna make the investment, you know, be sure you have all your ducks in a row and really try and stay on top of, we're gonna talk about maintenance and stuff, but like, you got to do your due diligence. There's things that you should do throughout the season, which, you know, for folks who are in the class, the extended class, we're going to try and get into detail so you're prepared for that. But just essentially, we just really, you know, really want to, you know, do all that we can to give them a fighting chance because of these challenges.
And it could be time consuming too, because like there's other things you could do too, like I said, planting flowers and maintaining your gardens and different things like that. Help with it too.
I just want to spend a few minutes talking about, you know, there are other ways to support pollinators, and this is kind of the more broad, you know, if you're particularly interested in beekeeping because you are aware of the concerns about, you know, the loss of bees or the loss of pollinators. You know, one of the biggest things that we can do is really contribute to efforts to create more habitat and forage for them. So there's one effort that's called No Mow May, because May is one of the biggest nectar flows for bees. And, you know, like Mark was referencing, there are a lot of flowers that are big nectar sources for bees that tend to live in lawns, like not super manicured lawns, but like clovers and you know, lots of the other, you know, lots of other flowers that tend to end up in those spaces. I'm drawing a blank right now, but John is saying like planting a rain garden, you know, rain garden would be akin to that, but there's lots of native varieties. This link, which I'll be sharing with everybody, the slides from the class, there's a few links with some resources on planting pollinator gardens. And really, you're just, like I kind of referenced earlier, the idea of pollinator gardens is to having flowering plants, particularly perennial flowering plants that are flowering all season long. So you know, with perennials, they usually flower for a certain time period. So early spring, mid-spring, late spring, so on and so forth. And so if we're having forages for them all throughout the season, that's a huge benefit. Also, there are some for some of the native bees, not honeybees. There are some really great resources out there for establishing habitat for them. These are some examples of bee hotels or bee houses, native bees. And a lot of these native bees tend to be either solitary or you know, they have small populations. But they're a huge contributor to the needs of our ecosystem and the needs of our vegetables and plants, in addition to what, you know, the contributions that honeybees make. And they're, you know, essentially you're just providing a habitat for them. They're not, it's not a big maintenance thing. It's kind of like set it and forget it for the most part. Let's see. So other questions here in the chat, coming back to the chat for a second. So John is asking, can we talk more about hive options in the future? I'm interested in building my own hives. Yeah, I mean, we'll at the next class, John, we'll talk about you know, some of the other hive options out there, and we can talk about, you know, how you can go about, you know, some of the different ways that you could build your own equipment. And then Jean is saying, my husband wants to weed and feed our lawn, and I don't because I'm worried about killing the dandelions. Any advice? Right. So this is something that is counterintuitive, or like this is, you know, those folks who are trying to get, you know, who are interested in perfect lawns. That's not, you know, that's not going to provide the habitat forage for the bees. So you can make a case that, you know, dandelions aren't the worst thing, and, you know, a perfect lawn isn't it's a hard conversation to have with some people who have particular ideas about what they want their lawn to look like. But maybe sharing with him some resources about what's going on with pollinators and talking about very simply just allowing the dandelions to survive is a really good thing for lots of native insects, which is a really cool and good thing.
Compost tea. if you're not going to
Oh
keep,
yeah, there are
make
other ways. There are definitely options for organic fertilizers for the lawn that will make the lawn lush and nice and but you're not killing the
still won't
weed.
have, you still won't have the dandelions technically, but at least you're not poisoning the bees.
Okay, and then a few just other questions. Mark, when you're sting yourself, how long would you say it helps your arthritis?
It's usually, I would say, about 6 months, but I actually haven't been stung in a year. So and I'm still not feeling like I need to be stung. So
Wow. Okay. And then Kelsey's asking, is there a defense for varroa mites? Yes, there are a number of treatment options, which we're definitely going to get more in detail on in the class. But just to suffice to say at this point, like there is a kind of a regimen of using some treatments. Nobody wants to use those kind of treatments, but they're like varroa mites are an unfortunate fact at this point. And if you are not, dealing with or treating for mites, you will 100%, you will lose your hives. And then finally, I have fruit trees and bushes such as elderberry, cherry, apple, peach, plum, celeste fig. However, I was told that bees may not pollinate them if they aren't lacking in that type of pollen. And that's another reason to have a diversity of flowering plants in your garden, is just to draw pollinators to your garden, so they visit those things that maybe they're not always inclined to pollinate at the beginning. So all of those things I think are, is just, if you focus on flowers, you probably will be okay. All those things tend to do pretty okay, just with a little bit of effort to get flowers in the garden.
Our fruit trees weren't doing anything until we got bees. So I don't know, maybe I don't know if they were lacking any of that type of pollen, but I noticed a big difference in production after we got bees for our fruit trees.
Right. I mean, so either having a honeybee hive or encouraging some of the native bees is gonna be a bonus for sure. Okay, so the inner workings of the hive. What is going on inside of the hive and how does it work? So at the height of the season, there are about 60,000 bees in a hive, and it's really interesting. The bees essentially function as what's called a superorganism. So which means that they work as a collective. They have a common goal. No one of those bees could survive without the rest of the collective. So an individual worker or an individual drone or a queen could not survive in the wild. They need each other to do their thing, to live to the next year, to survive, to create, and in that, in that concept of a superorganism, their method of reproduction as a superorganism is a swarm. Or an artificial swarm would be a split, where we artificially divide up the colony. And essentially when a swarm is happening, a swarm is where the queen sets up and lays one or two other queens that are capped, and then when the season's right and the population's right and everything, she takes half of the colony and they fly off and try and find a new home, and leaves the daughter behind to hatch out and to to start, to take over the home. But throughout the season, they are, basically, their goal is to build up population. From the spring, they are at a much reduced population because they need to reduce their population during the winter to survive the winter. And then slowly they build up their population as nectar forage is available and pollen and everything. And by the summer solstice, by the middle of summer, that is their kind of their peak of their population. And then, they're slowly, declining again. And by August, they're getting ready for the winter. They're getting their winter bees ready, because those are the bees that are going to need to survive the winter to start the cycle over again. Typically, worker bees, they take about 21 days or so to hatch out, and then they spend a few days developing, and then towards the end of their life, they live about a month. They essentially work themselves to death. So they're collecting food, they're building out their home. So they're drawing out comb, and they're getting themselves ready for winter. So there's, as I referenced earlier, this, the main kind of components of the hive, once it's all set up, is and they've been doing their work, is in the lower few boxes we have the brood nest, and on the edges of the brood nest is pollen, and then above the brood nest is where they're collecting honey, and filling out entire boxes of honey. And then they cap, once it's reduced down, to the right percentage of moisture, they cap it, and that is their future honey stores. That is their pantry. That is their winter pantry that they're going to be accessing to get them through to the next spring. And then, the queen, it will, they're raising new bees, essentially that they're the other thing that they're doing is increasing their population to care for the queen, to feed each other, to feed the drones, to protect the hive, to ultimately go out and forage for food and for stores for the winter. And again, as I had been talking, all this effort to get through to the next year. And then, as I mentioned this a little bit, they're also, they have particular bees that have designations for protecting the hive. There's a really awesome video that gives you a lot of visuals of the inner workings of the hive, including some better visuals of festooning, where they're drawing out the comb, and mating in flight. Like, there's these videos they put, I don't know how the heck they did it, but they put a camera on and basically when the queen mates with a drone, they do it in flight and the drone dies, and they got a camera on that, which is amazing. This is a really awesome video. Again, I'll be sharing the slides, so reference this later. This is one of the assignments for the class, for the extended class. So be sure and take a look at this. It's really fun. And then let's get into some more detail on the characters inside of the hive. Okay, so in this picture, who is a type of honeybee and who is the imitator? Anybody?
Okay, I'm guessing the yellow one on the left is the bad guy. That is not a honeybee.
Correct.
I think the fuzzy one is the honeybee, but I'm not sure. Oh,
That's
no.
right.
Oh,
And then, so on the left, we have a yellow jacket or a wasp, right? In the center is a worker bee, is a female honeybee. And on the right is a hoverfly, which does look very similar to a honeybee. It even has a little bit of fuzz on it, but it has slightly different wings. Once you get to looking, and we're going to be seeing bees a lot, you'll get to see, you'll kind of get the sense of the differences. Yes, hoverflies are cute too. This is just a public service announcement that people say all the time. Oh man, I was out at the park and I was eating my hot dog and drinking my Coca-Cola, and these bees kept bothering me. And bees will never come and bother you when you are out at the park, or they're going to never come after your food. Or bees are primarily, honeybees are only primarily interested in nectar sources, something that are sweet. I mean, they will do like they will go after like sweet syrupy type things, but they'll never go after proteins or other, and they aren't a menace or annoying like the yellow jackets or wasps are. So trying to change the dialect or the dialogue around, when people are talking about, oh, the bees are bothering me, try and say, no, it's the wasps, the honeybees, they don't bother us. Not to say that yellow jackets don't serve a purpose. They definitely have a place in our ecosystem, but they're just annoying. And so, but they're not a menace. Honeybees are not a menace. Just want to share that honeybees technically are not native to North America. They're actually native, and there's a whole story. I'm not going to get into the dirty details here, but just to state that, like, there was a whole process. They haven't been here forever. They aren't technically an imported species, but we've made it work. But there are lots of bees that are actually native to our region. That's another reason to, in addition to supporting honeybees, we should be thinking about supporting, our native bees. Ooh. Okay, so these are our three main characters that live in the hive. On the left, we have the workers. Those are the females. In the center are the drones. Those are the males. And on the right is the queen. Typically only one queen in the hive, and that's a female as well. You'll notice that she has a little paint speck on her back. Beekeepers will often mark queens to make it slightly easier to find them when they're trying to make sure, check on things in the hive, or needed to do things to manipulate the hive, or need to access the queen for there are a number of reasons that might be needed. It's not, it doesn't hurt her. It's just a help for, trying to play Where's Waldo. This will give you a general sense of what the population inside of the hive looks like at any particular time of right in mid-season. So there's going to be one queen, about 250 drones, roughly 20,000 female foragers. Those are the more mature workers, the females. And then about 40,000 house bees. So those are the ones that are younger or early hatched out recently. And then the queen is, there's going to be 5,000 to 7,000 eggs that the house bees are raising, as well as 7,000 to 11,000 larvae that are, pre-emergent, and on and on. So there's a lot going on. That's a lot of numbers. That's a lot of little lives inside of a hive at just one point in the season. Okay. Question. I put my empty hive out on the side to get ready for the class, and my neighbors became belligerent. She said she's allergic, but she doesn't like bugs. But she isn't allergic, but she doesn't like bugs. She told me that she is going to kill them if they are in her yard. Placement for me is of utmost importance due to the cost of bees. I haven't gotten the bees yet, but I want to make sure I have them set in the right spot. Yeah, so we'll get into detail on hive placement for folks in the class down the road. I didn't put this in the slide, but I want to emphasize and make sure that everybody knows that technically beekeeping is illegal in the city of Detroit currently. There is some movement on the urban agriculture, the urban livestock ordinance is been making some progress. But and hopefully we'll start to see some community engagement around that later this year, and maybe it'll technically be legal by sometime next year, but we'll wait and see. But in the meantime, you won't have any trouble with the city unless you have complaints. Animal control only responds to complaints. So this circumstance, definitely we need to consider, all the options here to make sure that we don't have any complaints from your neighbor. Oh. Okay, excuse me, come on. Okay, so more about the characters. The queen bee. Typically, actually, Mark, you mind jumping in on this one for a sec?
Yep. So a honeybee hive usually has only one queen. Now I've had instances where I've had more than one queen in the hive, but I don't believe all of them were laying. But the hive must have a queen to grow and survive. Of course, we know that because she's the one that's going to lay eggs, the eggs to keep the hive survivable. The queen is the only bee in the hive that lays fertilized eggs. So there are some times where a worker bee will turn into a layer, but they only lay drones, if I remember correctly.
Right.
And the queen lays approximately 1,200 to 1,500 eggs per day.
And usually the only circumstance where the workers start laying is just right. If the hive is, if the queen dies somehow. So moving on here.
You want me to take that?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. So the queen bee is longer than the worker bee and has longer legs. And that's like when you look at it, and when you're looking at the frames to try to find her, sometimes you'll see a drone that makes you think it's a queen, but she's even longer than the drone. Her only job is to lay eggs. They pamper her, they keep her warm. The worker bees, but she only lays eggs. She doesn't even feed herself. The worker bees feed and attend to her constantly. Her pheromone or her scent helps the workers know the hive is queen right and all is okay. And queen right means that there's a queen and that she's laying eggs. A queenless hive will lead to laying workers. I jumped again. Felicia says, I want to be a queen bee then.
Nice.
Eggs are tiny white specks at the bottom of the cells in the brood chamber. They kind of look like real small specks of rice. The queen lives longer than workers and drones, sometimes up to 2 to 3 years. And older queens don't lay as many eggs, so younger queens mean stronger hives. The queen does have a stinger, but uses it only in fighting other queens that may hatch in her hive. Beekeepers can use their bare fingers to pick up a queen without fear of getting stung by her.
There is a way to pick up workers too, which we'll talk about more, but yeah. Okay, drones, I'll jump on this one. Okay, Joy, you got a question?
Yes. Okay. So the question that I have, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. The question I have is, it's real simple. So I always have a ton of like bumblebees in the backyard, and they're really, I'm not afraid of those because they just mind their business, right? And I believe last year it was a honeybee because it looked different from the yellow jackets that are normally back there. Is it safe to say that if I saw like one or two honeybees, that it's like a hive somewhere or nest somewhere close by?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
They will forage. I mean, possibly. So they will forage up to 2 miles away from their hive. They will
Mhm.
travel.
Okay.
It's a good sign that there's somebody close by, though. Yeah, but it's not. There's not really any way to know, like, oh no, they're relative to say, well, they're close because they're in my yard, but
Well,
they'll travel pretty far distance.
well, that's what I was wondering because, like I said, I always see the bumblebees, but
Right.
last year, and it's probably because I have more of the pollinating flowers growing in my backyard. So
Uh-huh.
maybe, I'm thinking maybe, that's attracting them or whatnot. I was able to take, and I think it's a honeybee. I'm not for sure, but it looks like one of the worker bees. And I took a video of it, and it didn't, it was just kind of a little, I thought it was asleep at first. It was a little lazy. And but I was just wondering, like,
Yeah.
is it possible? But okay, that was it. Just want to know.
Yeah. Okay.
All right.
Okay, Nicole's got a question. This is a great question, Nicole. So if you buy a queen bee, how do you know if she's young or old? So when you get a marked queen, there is a different color for each year. So I believe the color this year is yellow, and so they'll rotate every year. So you can use the marking on the queen to know her age. If you buy a queen, it'll never be more than a year old. Usually, or it'll be really, when you're buying queens, they are usually young queens that have been mated already. We didn't even talk about, well, I guess a little bit more about, just that makes me think about that the queen, I didn't mention this, that the queen, essentially when it's young and it hatches out, so we were looking at those queen cells when I was talking about queen rearing. So when it hatches out, a few days after it comes out, it will go and mate, and it'll go out to drone congregation areas. So that's where the drones come into play. So drones from different hives will go and congregate. They will go and fly and like kind of hang out like a couple 100 feet in the air. And usually it's around the same time of day. And they will just it's like kind of like they're going to the bar, I guess. They're just going there and they're waiting for queens to mate with. And basically what happens and so there will be drones from all kinds of different hives. And this is where it's important thing about the genetic diversity. So they go to the drone, the drones are hanging out, and then the queen comes through and she'll mate with up to 20 drones and then she'll get, the sperm of all those different genetic lines. And she'll store all that in what this thing called the spermatheca. So she's got this sac in her belly or in her, her innards that will basically hold that sperm for the rest of her life, for the next 3 to 5 years. And at the same time, this is where the drama comes in. At the same time, every drone that she mates with, after they mate, the drones die. So crazy, right? And then she comes back to the hive and she doesn't go out and mate again. And then the rest of her life, she is just laying eggs, egg, 1,500 a day, egg in a cell. She does nothing else until, the only other kind of sometimes it comes about is there's this kind of balancing act that happens inside of the hive where her pheromone makes her scent, creates the balance inside of the hive, that everything's copacetic. And, but that on the other side of it, the workers will at some point, make a decision if the queen is getting old. But at some point they may decide that the queen needs to be replaced. And so they'll take one of the eggs that she laid and start making a new queen out of it by feeding it royal jelly. So the only genetic different, you know, any worker in the baby stages, any female egg can be turned into a drone. Or I'm sorry, can be turned into a queen. And so, and at that point, a queen, if she notices that there's other queen cells, they may battle it out, and she may kill, you know, they're to who's going to take over the hive. So there's a lot going on there. Okay, questions. Does the queen mate with around 20 drones during one flight, or does she go back and forth to the drone party per season? She'll do it on a couple of flights in the same time period. So like she may go out 2 or 3 times when, you know, right when she first starts mating, and then she's done. She doesn't go out every year. She collects that sperm, and that's what she's got for the rest of her life. Okay. So back to drones, right? So drones are the males. You'll notice that they have bigger eyes than the queen and the workers. Their main objective, their kind of you know, the main purpose that they serve is to preserve the genetic line. So they basically mate with other queens, and that's mostly it. They don't feed themselves. They you know, and they don't have it. So they hang out, the workers feed them, they go out to the drone congregation area, they mate, they die. That's about it. And at the end of the season, because, you know, when the bees are working, getting ready for the winter, they need to really be, you know, as efficient as possible. The workers kick out all of the drones. They kill them. They knock them out. They say, okay, we can't feed you anymore. We're like, we can only keep, you know, we're trying to keep the queen alive and keep enough workers alive to keep the hive going, and you got to go. And the queen will raise more of you guys next year. So they also serve, because they are large body size, they serve a purpose in, because the bees maintain the hive temperature by using their body heat, and there's a number of different ways that they do that, and they do not have stingers. So oftentimes people will practice picking up bees by picking up drones, because they don't have any risk of getting stung from them. Okay, drones live around 90 days. I think I addressed the rest of this. So yeah, again, just emphasizing that they get kicked out at the end of the season. And on to worker bees. This is the primary, like the main part of the population. Mark, would you mind taking this one?
The worker bees are all female. They are the majority of the population of the hive. Workers typically do not lay eggs, and if they do, the eggs are not fertile, producing only drones. Called laying workers, this typically happens when the hive becomes queenless. The worker bee will work inside the hive until she is around 21 days old. At 21 days, she begins foraging for nectar, water, pollen, and propolis. So this is like all the bees have different activities that they do. You know, they have different jobs. So when they go through their life cycle, their jobs change. At 21 days, she begins foraging for nectar, water, pollen, and propolis. For the next 9 days, she will work herself to death, usually only living to 30 days. So like I don't know if that's the next slide. Yeah. So they're like in their life cycle, like there's undertaker bees, there's bees that, you know, nursery bees, the bees that clean the hives. So those are like different activities that they do, the foragers, that kind of thing. So, oh, there you go, right there. So 1 to 2 days old, they have the job to clean the cells, and they start with the one they were born in. They also keep the brood warm. 3 to 5 days old, their job is to feed older larvae. 6 to 11 days old, they have the responsibility to feed the youngest larva. 12 to 17 days old, they are producing wax, carrying food, building combs, and having undertaker duties. At 18 to 21 days old, they are protecting the hive entrance and have guard duty. So like if you go to your hive and you stand in front of your hive and blocking the entrance, those are the bees that are coming out after you to try to make you move first. And then they might start trying to sting. From 22 days to the end of their life, at around 40 to 45 days, they fly from the hive and collect pollen, nectar, and water.
Okay. And then this is just a visual that gives you a sense of like what's happening with the queen laying the egg and the development of the bees, right? So at first she's laying, the eggs right in the bottom of the cells. It looks like a very tiny grain of rice when it's first laid. And then the bees are start to feed that egg as it develops with honey and pollen. And then it'll slowly develop larger and larger. Once it gets to certain size, the worker will come back through and will seal the cell with wax, and then the larva will spin a cocoon and change into a pupa, and then ultimately develop into a mature bee. Okay, that was a lot of information about the bees. Before we get into some of the protective gear and equipment, are there any questions? Are there special?
Did you say that the drones can be turned into queens?
No.
No, what you said some can turn into a queen?
Yeah, just to clarify, yes, I did say, and just to clarify, a female egg can be turned into a queen. So the difference between a worker and a queen is that a queen is fed a steady diet of royal jelly, which is a special, another special product that they produce from their bodies and from gathering from plants, that helps the genetics or the development of that female bee into a queen that is robust and it has the ability to do all the things that the queen does. You can there's a kind of a whole in-depth process to making whether us humans making a queen or that the bees do, but there is a difference in this way that the cell is set up and developed. But drones are males, and they cannot be made into queens.
Who did you say dies after 21 days?
Worker bees, so they'll basically, after they've hatched and done some of their jobs, they will work themselves to death for about 30 bees. Worker bees will live about 30 days. I'm not sure what we're saying about 21 days.
Go back a couple slides. I think I saw it.
Not that way.
Oh, boy. Your other back.
Yep.
One more. There. Wait. Is there one more slide back?
Yep, go back.
There.
Yeah.
21 days.
Yeah,
Oh, she works inside the hive until she's 21 days. Okay, that's what I thought I saw. Sorry about that. Thank you.
No problem. How do they determine which egg will turn into a queen? So the workers will kind of dictate that, because they will draw out queen cells. So whereas worker cells are horizontal, going sideways, they will usually draw out what's called a queen cup, which is a vertical cell that's up and down that looks kind of like the shape of a peanut. So if I go back, oh yeah, man, why is it hard to get the right direction? No. Okay. So right here. Okay, down this, you see these horizontal cells that look like a long peanut kind of? Those are queen cells, whereas in the lower left here are capped worker cells. So the workers will create some cells as kind of a just in case, and you will know that they are decided to that they're either going to swarm or supersede the queen if they actually if they actually start to develop that cell and cap it. So the queen will just, the workers make the cells, the queen just comes through and lays an egg. So she lays a cell in that egg and knows that there's not consciousness, but there's an indication that that process has begun. We will definitely be sharing slides and video from this there with all the participants in the class. Okay, keep it going here. So let's see. The queen can live for years, so I am sure that they can change out and continually caring for, wait. I'm wondering if there are specific workers that with that job only. Wait. So the workers' jobs change as they get older, as we kind of referenced with that one, with this slide I'm coming up on here, this one. As they get older in different stages of their life, the workers will do different jobs. Okay. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the tools and equipment. Essentially, there are lots and lots of different options for protective gear. I would say, if you're brand new to beekeeping, you want to cover all exposed skin, right? So you want to primary, first and foremost, you always want to cover your head. There are some beekeepers that are very, they've been doing it for years and they feel very comfortable with the bees. And there's a lot to be said for actually your disposition and not being nervous when you're keeping bees, because they can kind of sense that. But essentially, some beekeepers will just wear a veil, even like shorts and t-shirts and be totally comfortable. We always encourage people who are brand new to beekeeping just to cover head to toe. Usually always, trying to avoid darker colors, which is probably a good idea during summer months anyways, because wearing long sleeves is hot. Usually the beekeeping equipment, protective veils and stuff is white, and that helps a little bit with the sun. There are lots of different, equipment options out there. There are a few companies. I remember there was a question earlier that I didn't address about where to look for beekeeping equipment. Mark, would you mind just putting a few of the options for where to get bee equipment in the chat, like DDOT and all that?
Mm-hmm.
Joy, you got a question?
Oh, I do. You can tell that I'm typing. Well, a quick question. So I was reading about some of the bee gear, and I was reading where, like, near some of the zipper closures where bees are getting in. And so I guess the question that I was having is, like finding a good suit where, I'm not going to have bees in my suit.
Yeah, we'll go through that a little more in detail with class members, but like they're essentially, I think if you have another person there with you and you maybe have some, basically put on your gloves, put on your veil, your jacket, pants, making sure that, you got closed-toed shoes, you're either penny rolling your pants or using duct tape or whatever, like closing up all of any kind of opening. Zippers generally aren't a concern, but like you know, just making sure that there's no openings and you're going to be fine. And the ones that are out there are, you know, there's lots of good options. So we'll get into
Okay,
that.
last question. Is there particular colors that we shouldn't get when getting, or should we just stick to like a basic white or tan or something like that?
Yeah, light colors is all I would say.
Okay. Okay.
Yep. And then here's a few examples of like the full suits. There's one like this one in the middle on the right is, you know, is basically got ventilation. Like it's kind of a mesh material that, but it's also like thick enough that the bees can't sting through it. So it kind of breathes. You know, and so there's lots of different ways of jacket veil combos. I have one that's like a pullover veil. It's basically looks like, you know, your standard like long sleeve shirt, but it's got a veil that's attached to it, like the tops of these that we're seeing on the right hand side. And then I'll wear gloves, and then my, you know, I'll wear whatever pants I'm wearing. You know, regardless, whatever you do wear to the bee yard, be aware that you're gonna likely get stains on it. Like propolis, when it gets on your clothes, is a real pain to get off. And, you know, sometimes you'll get honey on your hands and honey on your, you know, stuff. And so, you know, don't wear your nicest clothes or your favorite pair of jeans or whatever. Gloves, another, I mean, you know, if there was two things I would recommend is like personally the pullover veil jacket combo, or a zip up jacket veil combo with, you know, some nice specific beekeeping gloves. And these have those long gauntlet arms, so you can, you know, pull them over your sleeves. So there's, you know, another limiting for the access point for the for, you know, the bees to get inside of. In terms of equipment, you know, this is a kind of an overview of the standard, kind of the industry standard for beekeeping for keeping bees. This is what's called the Langstroth hive. There are some other ways that people keep bees, like top bar hives or ware hives. And, you know, both myself and a number of folks that are bee club members have tried these things over the years. And I feel pretty strongly that this is the easiest system to be successful with. It's easy to manipulate. It's easy to inspect the hives. It's easy to extract honey from it, and also allow the bees to reuse the comb. So the concept here is that we have at the bottom here is a hive stand, and then up right above that is a bottom board. And then next would be what would be where the brood chamber is. And so those are two bee boxes. These are slightly deeper in depth, so they call them deeps. And then there's two. So in this case, there's two deeps. There's a queen excluder, two mediums, an inner cover, and an outer cover. So essentially, how you set up the hive, when you're starting out new, is that you would install the bees into one or two boxes at the bottom. Some people just do all mediums because it's more, you can interchange the boxes, and it's not as heavy to work with. Some people like the deeps more because it's kind of a bigger size that's more natural for where the queen is doing her work with the brood nest. The queen excluder is basically a screen that allows, it's small enough for the or big enough for the workers to get through, but the queen with her big booty can't get through it. So the queen can't go up into what would be where you're encouraging the bees to, you know, to store all the honey. So that's kind of you know, a basic rundown on Langstroth hive. Anything you would add to that, Mark?
Nope, not that I can think of.
Okay. Let's see. So, I mean, are you running mediums or deeps, Mark?
The package I just installed, I started with a deep, but I've been running mediums with like my nooks.
Okay. And then the other couple final things that you would need when you're getting started are a Hive tool. Here are 4 different examples of Hive tools. And essentially, when the biggest reason that you need to use a Hive tool is to pry boxes apart, because with the propolis in the hive, causes they're trying to seal up all those gaps and holes, and which basically makes them stuck together. And so with a little bit of pry, a little bit of hardened steel pry bar action to crack that. So you're opening, if you're taking a box off to look at the boxes below, you're also using it to separate frames and pry up frames when you're doing a hive inspection. So this is very much an essential tool. Of these 4, my favorite is the third one from the left, with the hook at the top, because it's got that little hook to help you pry up the frames, which is really a nice option. These other ones you can do that with, but sometimes you end up like kind of crushing some of the comb when you're doing that. All right. And then the smoker. So a smoker is a tool where basically what you're doing is you're putting a flammable substance like straw or hay, or like a hamster, like the shavings that they use for a hamster cage, like cedar shavings, and you're putting those inside of the smoker and lighting them, and then you're extinguishing them, but they're keeping them smoldering, so you're able to create smoke. And then there's this bellows on the back that you use to puff the smoke. What you're doing in this situation is you're using this to mask the pheromones in the hive. So the bees are communicating with each other about being defensive, or somebody's inside of the hive through the pheromones that they give off. And then secondarily, the smoke triggers a natural or an instinctive move for the bees to ingest some honey. So when a bee has honey in their stomach, it makes it harder for them to bend over, which it makes it harder for them to sting. So it's kind of a defensive move. It pacifies the bees. It pushes them down. It draws, pushes them away from whatever box that you're working with. And it also masks. So like basically you're using this in a judicious way. Like you don't want to like smoke. You don't want to like, pummel them with smoke. You're really just trying to, a few puffs of smoke, cause them to chill out a little bit, causes them to drive down deeper into the hive. If a few bees are flying around you, you might do a few puffs around you and your body, and that's mostly it. Some people, inspect their hives without a smoker, but it's always good to have on hand, because on some particular days and with the temperament of some particular hives, they will be more defensive. Some hives will tend to be aggressive, which is a genetic thing. So that may be if they're really defensive and you're finding that, it's hard to get in the hive with them without them becoming more aggressive, that you might be inclined to requeen. But by and far, most of the time, the bees are super chill. Oftentimes, I don't feel the need to use smoke. Like I'll open up, I'll get a sense if they're not starting to fly up in the air right away. You can get a sense of their temperament, and just move kind of calmly and methodically as you're looking through the hive, and they're generally pretty chill, and you can do your business, get out of there, get it in and out of there, try and get it, do your hive business within a few minutes, and everybody's happy. Okay. So now just to like a general overview of seasonal tasks. You talk to this, Mark?
Beekeeper's year and what to do and when. So check your hive at least every 2 weeks, year round. Is the queen laying well? Is nectar coming in? Do you need to add another super or another box? Any signs of pests? Like hive beetles is a one of pests. Ants, you could treat ants with cinnamon around the hive. Monitor for mites at least every 2 months. Spring, summer, and fall. Do you need to make a split after your hive overwintered? Treating for mites. I just learned something new the other day at our club meeting to treat as late as Thanksgiving for mites. Harvest honey late summer, early fall. August, queen starts to lay winter bees. So make sure the hive is strong before the winter. There's things you could do to prep the hive for the winter. Wind breaks and different things like that, wrapping them. Last mite treatment by Thanksgiving. Set up winter wind blocks. I jumped the gun again.
Oh, it's fine. It's fine. You're just, yeah.
Check for winter, spring feeding needs. You could feed them as long as it's not freezing. You could do sugar water. You could do sugar cakes for in the winter, like in the winter time. I'll put some paper towel on top of the hive on the inside, on the top of the frame, the top box, and put some sugar in it. And if they run out of honey, they'll start eating on the sugar. And it gets them, through the winter if they run out of honey stores. Spring flowers, yay. Maples, dandelion, they can feed themselves again. So, and that's after the winter going into the spring.
Great. Okay, so
I know London got a question.
yeah,
So it said, she says, how many times should you allow the bees to sting in one bee session or hive visit? Technically, we don't want to get stung at all, but in my experience, I've had 3 at one time, 3 or 4, I think, where the area where I got stung, it started to swell up. So I went and sat down. I didn't feel any different. So I'm not 100% sure how many times. I guess it's different per person, how many times you can be stung. If you're a little allergic, you'll have a reaction. But I would say, well, first try not to get stung. But if you start feeling any kind of thing, get away from the hive. If you get stung, start getting stung, you should hurry up and close the hive. And especially if they're stinging you through a soup, that means they're pretty aggressive or they really don't want you in the hive, and just close it up and walk away.
so a few things to make a note about is that you'll notice that I'm saying here, monitor for mites, treat for mites. We're going to get into this in much more detail as the class goes on, but just to note that just mites are, you have mites. It's not a matter of do I have mites or do I not have mites. Like the state of affairs is that essentially, you can be pretty much guaranteed that every hive has mites. It is a huge problem, it is an epidemic. And so it's not a matter of should I treat, it's when will I treat. And it's just an unfortunate kind of reality at this point. So I just want to emphasize that one more time. So moving on, go ahead, Mark.
I was just gonna say it's okay to baby them. I've had experimental years where I didn't do hardly anything, and had the worst outcomes. Hives dying or whatever. I mean, there might be times when you do everything you think is possible and you still lose them. But I've had the most success when I baby them. And when I say baby, I'm talking about I've put bees inside of a shed I made sure the shed was, wasn't drafty, put windbreaks up and, treated it all year long. And I've had the most success when I've done that.
There's a question here in the chat. When you harvest honey, should you leave some in the hives for the bees? If so, how much?
I'm trying to remember. I know what I do is if I usually leave a super on if I have a super. So hopefully when you're going into the fall, you have enough where you could take out. There's been times when I haven't had enough and I might only take like 3 or 4 frames of honey out and leave the rest. But you want to be able to pick up that super and you kind of judge how heavy it is. But I would say try to go into the season at least with 6 frames. And I say that only because I also add sugar for winter. So I don't feel bad about taking too much honey. So there's not if you just, your first year, just let me back up. Your first year, don't expect to get honey because you want to leave all those stores as much as possible on the hive going into the winter. So if you started a package this spring, don't expect to get honey unless it go gangbusters. But you want to try to leave as much honey on there for the winter, for the first year. But then after that, you can take stuff out. Like I said, if you're picking up the super and it's real heavy, that's a good way to determine how much honey should be left on the hive. But I always supplement with sugar.
Yeah. There'll be varying opinions about how much to leave on, but you should definitely consider leaving on. That's the primary goal, making sure that they have enough honey for the winter, and then what above and beyond that is what you can harvest. So that's it. And typically, there's a number of different ways, the big honey flows are essentially starting, in the next couple of weeks through June are the biggest honey flows of the year. And then there will be what's called the dearth or the dry period, when we have July and August, which are more hot and dry and there are less flowers available. So oftentimes people will do a summer harvest in early July, take those boxes off, maybe even not even extract it yet, to encourage the bees to stimulate them to collect more honey. And then if they need the honey, they put it back on. Or some people will just wait till September. But like Mark said, it's always a good idea first year to leave as much as possible on the hive, really giving them the biggest fighting chance over the winter. Joy.
Yes.
Did you have a
I think
question?
her hand was still up.
Oh no, you know what it? Oh, that's what it is. Oh, I didn't know how to lower it. No, I don't have a question.
Okay. So there's a question here. Should you use organic sugar or does it matter? Definitely, it may sound counterintuitive, but you definitely use white sugar. Basically, and you can use organic sugar if you want, but oftentimes when it's organic sugar, it's still got some of those other, it hasn't been refined. And really, so if you think of nectar, it's very simple. Like he was talking about in that video that we watched about how honey is made. And we're just trying to, as best we can, approximate that. So we're just trying to use just standard sugar. And we're, there's different ways to apply it, dissolving it in water and so forth. And then other questions here. I've had both wasps, multiple hives, and what were told me to be ground bees create their homes in my backyard. Actually, the bees were in the underside of my patio sofa. Will a wasp colony attack bees, and do different bee species live peacefully together? Wasps are, will try and rob from hives. Usually they'll do it as individuals, and a strong hive can definitely handle that. They can deal with, singular wasps coming in and doing some robbing, and they'll take them down and just doing, kill them. A weak hive is at risk, if they are weakened by they're dealing with their heavy mite problems or whatever, and they're just in a weakened state, then ultimately the scavengers like the wasp will become problematic. And then next question, if you grow stevia, can you dehydrate it and feed it to the bees, or is sugar the only option? Just thinking about supply chains and if sugar isn't available. Stevia is a sweetener, but it is not a carbohydrate source. It is, it imitates sweetness to our palate. So it is not going to be a source of energy for the bees. Ultimately, always the primary and best food for the bees is going to be honey that they produce themselves from nectar. But sugar is going to be, our second use. We are getting down to, needing to wrap up for the day. And I just want to spend a few minutes on these last few slides. So, sorry, we might go a few minutes over. I understand if you need to take off for the day right at noon. I do want to respect people's time. We are recording this, and we will be sharing the slides with people in the class today afterward, but I'm just going to keep going here, and then if folks have a few questions after the fact, that's just fine.
I need to leave,
That's fine.
Take
Thanks,
care,
Mark.
everyone.
Thanks for coming on, Mark. Appreciate you.
Welcome. And I left my email in the chat.
Okay. Okay. So placing hives, you always want to have, a source of water and full sunlight. You always want to think about convenience and traffic. So you always want to think about a situation where you don't need to be, there's not like, it isn't a thoroughfare or a place that people walk regularly, is where basically the bees are coming and going from, one side of the hive all the time, the entrance. So they're not, there's only one side of the hive, and we point that in the ideal location. Oh, I don't know what just happened there. Okay. You guys still there?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep, we're still
my
here.
screen just jumped off for a second, and I was like, oh no. Okay. So, face the hive. Generally you want to face it east or south if you can, but you're just thinking about, mowing. Don't want to, if you do need to mow around it, you might want to wear beekeeping equipment when you're doing that. Always place your hives in as much sunlight as possible and avoid shaded areas. That just can, you're just trying to give them, particularly during winter months, the kind of optimal siting location. Going to raise the hives off the ground. That'll help reduce, problems with things like ants and mice. And I just want to spend 1 second talking about bee space. So bee space is like when in the design of the Langstroth hive is the space between these frames. And essentially that allows for the bees to do their work on both sides of the frame, on both sides of the comb, to get in and out of the cells. If it's any larger than 3/8 or roughly 3/8, they will start to fill that in with comb or propolis, based on how big the space is. So like, for instance, if you're working in the hive and you pull out a frame and you forget to put the frame back in, next time you come there, they're going to start to fill that in with comb, and it's going to be wild comb, and it's going to be connected to 2 frames, and it's going to be a mess, and you're probably going to have to cut it out and waste that effort for them. So they want to fill out the space. And that's another reason that when we're starting at different points in the season, we only we reduce the hive down to the population. The size of the hive is in direct relation to the population that can build to build up the hive to fill out for babies and food and so forth. So if you have a hive, you buy hive equipment, you get 5 boxes. You don't start with all 5 boxes. You start with 2, and they build up those 2. And then, as those 2 are almost full, they're like 80 or 90% full. Then you add another box and another box and so on and so forth. Okay, so we're going to wrap up the presentation here. And I know we are at time, but for those who still have questions, I'm happy to stick around for a few minutes. There was a question about participating in the class. So Amanda, unfortunately, the class is currently full, and we are no longer accepting students for this season. But we definitely do this every season. So you can, if you want to drop me an email, I'll make sure that you get on the list for next year, to make sure that you see the application for next year. And while I'm typing my email, does anybody have questions?
In that 3-box configuration that you were showing there in that yard, are bees, are they loyal to each box, or do they interchange within the box? Like, because by being so close to each other,
Yeah.
do they
great
populate
question.
other boxes?
Right. Great question. So you're talking about different hives, this is a hive here, and then and a few feet away is another hive. And
Yeah.
if you would, okay. So, so that basically, there will be sometimes what's called drift, where they will go out and forage, and they come back to another hive kind of accidentally. So from time to time you will notice that, say, one of those 3 hives will the population will look much bigger than the other ones, and you can kind of equalize them. You can shake bees off.
That's your birthday.
So it's something that you need to manage, but it's not necessarily a concern.
Okay.
And
when
keep going.
Those you say all the lifespan of the workers, like 45 days, when they die, do they leave the hive to die, or do they die in the hive and they have to clean it out constantly, from the ones that died, or is it something that tells them to leave the hive when their life cycle is over?
There's definitely bees that die inside the hive. So I think it's kind of both circumstances happen. I think they just kind of literally work themselves to death, and from time to time, the undertakers will just take them out and drop them in front of the hive.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Okay. So, question: should we have any safety equipment for our next in-person session? No. We will be. I'll be sharing an email for those in the class. I'll be following up with what to prepare for the next class, but we're going to be just focusing on equipment and showing how to build it and talking more about equipment, and a few other things. How can you join the beekeeping club? So folks who graduate from the class are welcome to join the club, or if you're actively keeping bees, you can contact me and I'll share information on how to get involved. We meet once a month. So basically, yeah, if you're in the class, we're going to get you involved in the club once you finish the class, but there might be some crossover opportunities. Let's see. When you make a split, do the split hives fight? No, they don't typically fight. They usually, the bees will, like, there will be a point in the season when, particularly when nectar sources are low and stuff, that hives will rob from each other, and they will fight when they do that. They will, and so you will see, like, if there's a particularly weak hive, you will see them kind of fighting in front, like bees fighting bees in front of the hive. And so you may want to reduce the entrance or
A
there's
bee
there's
fight? I bet
has to
that's
do with
fun.
that. Tiffany, please mute yourself if you could.
Oh, sorry.
Okay. Any other questions for the good of the order? Okay. Well, in that case, hopefully you guys got some good information today. I will share the video and slides beginning of next week. And for those in the class, I will see you next Saturday in person. I'll be sharing details in an email this week, and we'll see you then. Have a good Saturday, y'all.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, bye.